On the 5th of January, 1942, while the street of Tokyo still echoed with exultant shouts celebrating the dizzying initial victories, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, issued a sober command. He instructed the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to immediately commence planning for the critical second phase of Pacific operations. His comprehensive study of the situation reports arriving from the Philippines, Malaya, and all points south confirmed that Japanese forces were rapidly consolidating control over East Asia and the vast territories targeted in the swift December offensive. Yamamoto, recognizing the potentially fleeting nature of this momentum, directed his chief of staff, Mado Magaki, to ensure these strategic plans were finalized by the crucial middle of February. The astonishing speed with which the Western Pacific had been conquered, however, had not unified Tokyo's leadership. Rather, it precipitated sharp internal discord within the Imperial General Staff. A powerful faction of ardent military nationalists, intoxicated by the unbroken string of successes, insisted on pressing the offensive relentlessly, regardless of the logistical or strategic overstretch such planning might entail. Yamamoto represented the opposing viewpoint. Having been less than enthusiastic about initiating war with the United States and Britain, he viewed the future with deep apprehension. This inherent pessimism was so well known that Yamamoto's physical location, aboard the combined fleet flagship Yamato at sea, was largely a protective measure, urged by friends on the Imperial General Staff who feared he might be assassinated in Tokyo due to his public opposition to unlimited, protracted warfare. Even now, his opinions were no secret from those around him. His chief of staff, Admiral Agaki, reflected this need for restraint, noting in his diary the imperative for far-sighted statesmanship, even following the glorious victory of the first month. These were the very words Yamamoto had used repeatedly in his warnings, that Japan could not sustain a long-term war against the combined industrial might of the Western powers. His open criticism was aimed squarely at politicians like Prince Kono and others who he believed lacked a coherent strategy for the war Japan was now waging in the Pacific. 3 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with his friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultranationalist Kakusu-do organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Chiba. Warning Sasakawa that war was inevitable due to decisions taken by the politicians, Yamamoto employed a vivid metaphor. At first, we'll have everything our own way, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. Now, just a month after the war had begun, the octopus was spread almost flat. Yamamoto, however, had also warned his old friend that this aggressive euphoria could not possibly last. He defined a precise moment for a crucial political action, the moment Singapore fell. That strategic disaster, he predicted, would profoundly unsettle the British hold on India, making them undoubtedly willing to listen to talk of peace. Yamamoto's insight stemmed from deep personal experience. He had served on the delegations to the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934, and had been the Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, giving him a rare, informed understanding of both British and American resolve. He conceded that once the war was started by the politicians, a decisive initial victory was mandatory, but he firmly believed Japan would have only a fleeting window, a year and a half, to bask in glory before the tide inevitably turned. We must get a peace agreement by then, he had stressed to Sasakawa, relying on his old friend to convey this urgent message among the right-wing political leaders who were currently in power. On January 5th, the notion of ultimate victory seemed undeniably close at hand. The American battleship fleet lay crippled at Pearl Harbor following the December 7th strike. The British capital ships, HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales, had been dramatically sunk off the Malay coast. In the Philippines, Manila, and the critical United States naval base at Cavite had been captured. The British had surrendered at Hong Kong, and Japanese forces were already executing new landings across the Dutch East Indies, seizing strategic points like Rabaul on New Ireland, Ambon, and key islands within the Solomon chain. Yet, even amidst this cascade of triumphs, the attack at Pearl Harbor had failed to deliver Yamamoto's ultimate objective, the total destruction of the major elements of the United States fleet. Crucially, the American aircraft carriers, which had been at sea on December 7th, remained unharmed. The The swift, unanticipated fall of Singapore on February 15th, month ahead of Admiral Yamamoto's projections, paradoxically amplified the strategic threat rather than alleviating it, to achieve his ultimate objective. Setting the stage for favorable peace negotiations, Yamamoto recognized the necessity of a spectacular, immediate military achievement. The strategic planning staff immediately faced the critical question of the next target. Yamamoto's initial suggestion for an assault on the Soviet Union was summarily vetoed by the Imperial Japanese Army. A land war of that magnitude was unfeasible, while the Army remained deeply committed across the vast theaters of China and Southeast Asia. 3 alternative strategies consequently emerged. Yamamoto's personal preference was a bold thrust into the Indian Ocean, involving the invasion of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, to lure out and annihilate the British Far Eastern Fleet, mirroring the success achieved at Pearl Harbor. This ambitious plan envisioned pushing into the Middle East to establish a critical link with German forces driving toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, thereby guaranteeing Japan the vital petroleum resources it desperately required. However, the Army categorically refused to support a Middle Eastern operation, deeming the logistical commitment too extensive. With the Caucasus option closed, only 2 major alternatives remained. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo championed a comprehensive attack on Australia, intending to deprive the Americans of their crucial forward base of operations. This strategy demanded first securing the Solomon Islands, followed by the systematic occupation of New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Proponents within Imperial General Headquarters were already drafting administrative systems for the governance of Australia and New Zealand. Yet, Yamamoto dismissed the Australia plan. He judged it too protracted and insufficiently decisive to halt the gathering momentum of American industrial power. Yamamoto understood a critical factor that his planners often overlooked. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had not paralyzed the Americans, but instead ignited a profound spirit of vengeance in a populace the Japanese had mistakenly judged as soft and incompetent. It became chillingly apparent that even the capture of Singapore would not suffice. Yamamoto demanded a victory so overwhelming that it would compel the United States to accept a generous peace settlement. In January, Yamamoto ordered the drafting of a new operational design. 2 months later, officers delivered the finalized documents to Tokyo. The primary strategy was the Designated Me Plan, which targeted a decisive engagement off Midway Island designed explicitly to destroy the remaining American carrier force. Simultaneously, the supporting AL Plan detailed the invasion of the North American continent via the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, with the long-term goal of occupying Hawaii and potentially threatening the West Coast. Victories at Midway and in the Aleutians, Yamamoto argued, would provide the essential political leverage for the negotiated peace he desperately sought. Despite the fierce strategic debates among admirals around the conference table in the Navy Ministry, Yamamoto ultimately secured authorization for his plan. The significance of the early victories at Singapore and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor faded in the face of a far greater shock. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber raid on Tokyo in April 1942. The Doolittle Raid shattered the Japanese sense of invulnerability, demonstrating that the Americans were only beginning to commit fully to the fight. When the Midway operation flamed into disaster for Japan in June, resulting in the catastrophic loss of 4 fleet carriers, the news was rigorously suppressed, known only to the highest echelons of the Navy, while the Army remained largely ignorant of the defeat's full scope. Crucially, even as Yamamoto pursued his fateful Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had steadily shifted naval and air assets southward, establishing Rabaul on January 23rd as the staging area for the forthcoming attempt to sever the supply lines to Australia. Constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against New Guinea and other islands made this intention clear to the Australians, who promptly communicated their grave concerns to General Douglas MacArthur. Upon General Douglas MacArthur's arrival in March 1942, the immediate strategic reality was the imminent threat posed by the Japanese advance toward New Guinea. Should this vital territory fall, a nearly uncontested path would open for the Japanese conquest of northern Australia, a threat underlined by the bombing of Darwin in February and the invasion of Salamaua, New Guinea, in March, which dramatically increased the pace of Pacific War. In May, just preceding the climactic Battle of Midway, the Japanese dispatched an occupation force toward Port Moresby. However, this convoy was decisively repulsed by the fierce combined defense of American and Australian forces during the carrier engagement known as the Battle of the Coral Sea. Despite this defensive victory, the Japanese successfully occupied Tulagi, situated north of Guadalcanal, where they immediately began constructing a critical seaplane base. The Coral Sea engagement served as a stark confirmation for planners in Washington and Australia. They had to prepare for a major Japanese move into the South Pacific. MacArthur informed the Australian government that they must achieve readiness for a direct attack before the generally anticipated, but geographically distant, Japanese thrust against India could materialize. He cabled General Marshall demanding 2 carriers and 1,000 planes to stabilize the theater. Yet, the constraints on American naval power were severe. In Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed General Marshall that the entire Pacific Fleet would possess only 2 working carriers until the end of June, a meager force compared to 10 carriers the Japanese held on the eve of Midway. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already issued advance warnings regarding the massive operation he expected the Japanese to launch, which indeed became the Battle of Midway. While the pivotal carrier battle was unfolding, the Japanese were simultaneously consolidating their territorial gains in the New Guinea Solomons area. Major General Tamataro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salamaua, while naval troops occupied La and initiated construction of a critical air base there. Notably, the Imperial General Staff had planned the resumption of the Port Moresby operation independently of Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet strategy. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake was ordered to press onward toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to prepare to resume the advance against Port Moresby by July, following the anticipated return of Admiral Yamamoto and his combined fleet, which was expected to shield this new southern movement. Crucially, despite the actual defeat at Midway, which was misrepresented to forces in the field as a victory, Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its southern expansion plans. A few days after the Midway engagement, the Australians informed General MacArthur that Japanese forces were ready to attack. In view of the reported victory, MacArthur immediately suggested a bold Allied preemptive attack on the New Britain, New Ireland area, followed by an assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air fortress in the region. MacArthur proposed that with the 2 requested carriers, the 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division, he could force the Japanese back to truck. On June 12, General Marshall presented a modified version of the MacArthur plan to Admiral King, requesting 3 carriers instead of 2, along with 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions for the assaults. Admiral King vehemently opposed the proposal, primarily because it would put MacArthur in command of the fighting. King's supplementary objections cited the vulnerability of the carriers to land-based air attack and the lack of sufficient protection. Tactical problems the Navy would soon be forced to confront at Guadalcanal. King devised his own counterplan, a drive launched from a New Hebrides, placed entirely under Navy command, though MacArthur strongly objected to his Army forces. Serving under naval authority, no one could deny the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they secured New Guinea and posed an existential threat to Australia. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were thus faced with conflict over who would command the operation. They resolved the dispute by assigning Phase 1, the primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions, directly to Admiral King. Guadalcanal itself was, at that time, merely an unnamed coordinate on the map, lacking any known tactical or strategic significance in the initial JCS plan, while General MacArthur was afforded a political concession elsewhere in the theater. The strategic mandate following Phase 1 dictated that Admiral King would assume control of operations aimed at eliminating Japanese resistance throughout the remainder of the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. King ultimately prevailed in the contentious debates among the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who recognized that his proposed defense line, designed to safeguard Australia, required significantly fewer resources than General MacArthur's expansive demands. Thousands of American troops were already undergoing strenuous training in New Caledonia, a build-up supported by King, who had successfully persuaded General Arnold to commit several critical squadrons of United States Army Air Force planes to theater. Further securing the vital island chain, King reinforced key positions in Samoa and Afada in the New Hebrides, simultaneously laying the groundwork for a crucial forward base in Tonga. Personnel shifts followed the strategic redirection. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose perceived indecisiveness during the critical Wake Island crisis had deeply frustrated King, was reassigned to establish the newly formed Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. Here, he and Marine Major General Holland Smith were entrusted with the vital, urgent task of pioneering and developing the specialized techniques necessary for effective island warfare, a skill set the Allies desperately lacked. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, then articulated the grand strategy. The initial effort must prioritize holding the South Pacific line while simultaneously perfecting the amphibious forces. The second stage mandated a combined offensive involving the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, pushing through the Solomon Islands toward the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. Stage 3 involved the siege of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, paving the way for the final fourth stage, striking either the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. Admiral King immediately sanctioned this comprehensive four-stage plan, which perfectly mirrored his own strategic vision. Arrangements were swiftly made to recall Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, then serving as a naval observer in London, to assume command of the newly established South Pacific Command. Concurrently, King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the plan's division, directing him to prepare for the role of commander for forthcoming amphibious operation. This entire structure was formalized even before the Japanese launched their assaults on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley departed Washington on May 1st, slated to officially take command of the South Pacific Force on June 19th, but his first duty required reporting to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, who would serve as his direct superior. By the time Gormley reached the Pacific, the Japanese offensive was already gathering pace. On May 22nd, an Army observation plane detected a Japanese photo-reconnaissance aircraft meticulously surveying Guadalcanal, prompting Army intelligence to suggest the enemy would prepare and construct an airfield there. The evidence solidified rapidly. A June 25th Army intelligence report confirmed that the dense grass on the island's central plain had been deliberately burned off. Tents were erected in the area, and a wharf was clearly under construction at Lunga Point. 6 days later, an invaluable Australian coast watcher operating secretly on Guadalcanal transmitted a chilling update. Construction of a full airfield was imminent, awaiting only the arrival of Japanese engineering units. He provided the crucial names: the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, the imperial equivalent of American CB construction units. This vital information was quickly confirmed via a crucial radio interception made by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Group, which had successfully broken significant portions of the Japanese naval code, picked up a message confirming that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would reach their destination on July 4th. Fleet intelligence immediately correlated the data. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that very day, en route to prepare for an amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific, when Admiral Nimitz received the definitive report. The puzzle was solved. Admiral Turner now knew his destination could be no other place than the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, New Zealand, boarding his flagship, the USS Macaulay, a vessel converted from the former Grace Line passenger ship Santa Barbara. His daunting task was to forge a complete amphibious task force, ready for combat within a single month. As Turner commenced the rapid deployment of ships and men, Admiral Gormley was simultaneously moving toward Melbourne to coordinate strategy with General MacArthur. Admiral Robert Gormley departed New Zealand burdened by profound apprehension regarding the viability of the planned amphibious assault, a complex operation for which Allied forces were manifestly unprepared. General Douglas MacArthur, who held his own deep skepticism concerning the scheme, concurred entirely with Gormley's assessment. Crucially, both commanders agreed that the limited air assets currently available precluded the guarantee of sufficient air coverage for the landing forces. This urgent consultation, held on July 18th, just 3 weeks before the scheduled invasion, culminated in a dispatch sent to Washington strongly recommending the deferral of the operation. However, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King, the driving force behind the aggressive push, was unmoved. King had previously warned his new theater commander that he was inheriting a difficult assignment and that the requisite material might not be available until the autumn. The answer from Washington was unequivocal. The invasion would proceed precisely as planned. Gormley, who had left Washington convinced the United States was ill-equipped for aggressive action in the South Pacific, watched his pessimism deepen as his attempts to secure immediate deployment of vital construction battalions, CBs, and other necessary units to New Zealand failed. From its inception, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was compromised by glaring failures of Allied intelligence. While all concerned commands knew that an operation was imminent, especially after Admiral Nimitz issued operations orders to Gormley on July 10th, the Allies severely underestimated the speed and scope of the Japanese buildup. The major Japanese airbase at Rabaul posed a clear threat. Plane staging from those fields could easily refuel at Guadalcanal and subsequently bomb Australia, delivering a potentially deadly blow to the entire Allied logistical buildup. Yet, the intelligence report reaching King on July 10th contained only a casual mention of airfield construction at Guadalcanal. A few days later, a subsequent report compounded the error by mistakenly locating the nascent field on the wrong side of the island. By the close of July, the Japanese had fully completed the airfield installation. Recognizing the strategic advantage, Admiral Yamamoto, at Combined Fleet Headquarters, issued orders for the first major stage mission to depart Rabaul on August 14th. As commander of the overall United States effort, Admiral Gormley struggled desperately to secure additional support, hasten the construction of advanced bases, and bring in more aircraft. Everywhere he turned, he encountered the hard reality of Admiral King's assertion. The proper tools were simply unavailable. The logistical organization for the invasion forces was abysmal. Supplies, for instance, were loaded haphazardly or hodgepodge onto transports at Oakland. Despite the ample dock space available for the systematic unloading and reloading of ships, sequencing supplies based on their intended use, the vessels were instead dispatched to Numia, a location lacking the necessary facilities for such complex logistical sorting. Admiral King possessed at least a general understanding of these operational difficulties, but time was the ultimate tyrant. King understood better than any of his subordinates the absolute strategic necessity of halting the Japanese advance before it could fully consolidate its position against Australia. The timetable remained inflexible. By late July, the rush was frantic, with 17,000 Marines moving rapidly by troop ship from California, Pearl Harbor, Numia, and Samoa. The intensity of the final preparations meant Admiral Gormley was too preoccupied to convene a general conference of his commanders. Consequently, on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, designated as a tactical commander, called a crucial meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. This gathering marked the first time the tactical unit commanders met face-to-face to discuss the imminent invasion. The command structure was clear. Admiral Fletcher was tasked with protecting the invasion with his carrier task force, while Admiral Turner was responsible for delivering the troops of Marine General Alexander Vandegrift to the beachhead. Though garrison troops were slated to follow once the Marines secured the island, the operation had been organized so hastily that no provision whatsoever had been made for any reserve forces. There were, critically, no additional men available in the South Pacific theater. The meeting on the Saratoga was anything but encouraging. Fletcher immediately set a grim tone by announcing that he would only guarantee protection for the Guadalcanal landings for a maximum of 2 days. He insisted, and Gormley's staff members present concurred, that the irreplaceable carrier assets must not be risked in protracted close support. The internal friction among the American High Command was palpable as a decision to risk the first major offensive neared execution. Admiral Richmond K. Turner, possessing a superior grasp of the overarching global military strategy than perhaps any other man in the cabin that day, sharply rebuked his superior officer. Turner dismissed the utility of continued argument, stressing that the critical decision had been made. Their duty was now the rigorous execution of orders. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the designated carrier commander, should have understood this operational imperative, especially given professional scrutiny he faced after the Battle of the Coral Sea. Admiral Ernest J. King had been profoundly dissatisfied with Fletcher's perceived reluctance to engage the enemy, insisting that Admiral Chester W. Nimitz assess the state of Fletcher's fighting resolve. Nimitz, a man of congenial temperament who held a personal liking for Fletcher, had offered encouragement, and Fletcher's overall command performance at the decisive Battle of Midway could not be entirely faulted. Nevertheless, on the very precipice of the first American offensive operation, Fletcher's decision to forewarn the landing troops and support ship crews that his crucial carrier air cover would be prematurely withdrawn within 48 hours constituted a profoundly inauspicious commencement. The final rehearsal for the impending Guadalcanal invasion was staged at Kororo Island near Fiji, commencing on July 28th and lasting 3 days. The exercise proved deeply flawed. Barely one-third of the assigned troops successfully made landfall, and upon reaching the beach, they were plagued by confusion regarding their tactical objectives. General Alexander A. Van de Grift deemed the mock-up assault a complete failure. Yet, the relentless schedule of war permitted no time for delay or second-guessing. By July 31st, the Marines were re-embarked aboard the transports, steaming toward Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6th, as the task force of 75 ships neared the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher, acting on his deep-seated reservations, nervously detached his carriers. Although his aircraft would provide the promised initial air cover over the landing zone, the 26 ships of the carrier group were deliberately maneuvered as far from immediate danger as possible. If American intelligence was flawed enough to permit the Japanese buildup of the airfield at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence proved even more critically deficient. As the massive United States invasion fleet assembled and maneuvered across the South Pacific, the Imperial Command remained entirely oblivious to the imminent assault. In July 1942, the Japanese Army's principal focus was the capture of New Guinea, intended as a vital staging point for subsequent operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas force landed 2,000 troops near Buna. Following the seizure of Buna, the Japanese planned to construct airfields there as a prelude to a renewed offensive against Port Moresby. Consequently, throughout July, Japanese air power was concentrated heavily on the Port Moresby area. Bombers and fighters repeatedly swept over piers and airfields almost daily. Japanese air assets were also heavily committed to supporting the Buna beachhead, fixing their attention on this new drive throughout the early days of August. The combined Australian and American air forces countered this pressure with retaliatory raids on Japanese air bases at Lae. During these intense preparations, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flagship, the mighty Yamato, remained anchored in Japanese waters at Ashima. He was leisurely overseeing preparations for forthcoming air operations over Australia, intending to assess the necessary next steps thereafter. In preparation, the Naval Air Group stationed at Lae were recalled to Rabaul on August 3rd, intending to ready them for the expected Guadalcanal operations that would commence the following week. The South Pacific skies during the first week of August were heavily clouded, restricting visibility. Only a minimal number of Japanese search planes managed to take flight, and critically, none located the powerful American armada steaming inexorably toward Guadalcanal. Japanese airmen flying out of Rabaul were genuinely surprised when they encountered American carrier aircraft in the skies around Buna, having been assured that the United States carriers had been destroyed definitively at Midway. The pilots erroneously concluded that these carriers were operating in conjunction with the Australian forces that had reportedly traversed the rugged Owen Stanley Mountains, not realizing they were conducting training maneuvers for a massive, impending invasion. Neither the Imperial High Command nor field commanders suspected a forthcoming Allied landing. After 8 months of continuous, sweeping victories, it was simply inconceivable to the Japanese that the Allies possessed the capacity to launch such a large-scale offensive. The notion of a successful seaborne invasion of this theater was met with profound skepticism. Military leaders, including General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley, generally concurred that such an operation faced near insurmountable odds. Yet, as the American Expeditionary Force steamed toward Guadalcanal, it retained the crucial advantage of complete surprise. On August 4th and 5th, the 75-ship Armada advanced beneath a heavy, overcast sky. By August 6th, the fleet navigated persistent rain squalls throughout the day. This atmospheric concealment was shed dramatically as dawn broke on the morning of August 7th. The sky cleared, granting the carrier air wings the optimal visibility required for precision strikes. The fleet sounded general quarters at 5:30. Precisely at 6 o'clock, the first strike wave roared off the decks. Planes launched from the USS Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise were assigned critical targets: Guadalcanal Island, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese, who maintained a vital seaplane base connecting Gavutu and Tanambogo via a narrow causeway, had been grounded by poor weather the previous day. Admiral Fletcher's task force noted only a single unidentified aircraft sighting, though its origin, whether Japanese reconnaissance or stray plane from General MacArthur's command, remained inconclusive. The element of tactical surprise held until 6:12 a.m., when the communications headquarters at the Tulagi seaplane base broadcast a frantic, unencrypted distress signal. The succinct, chilling message, transmitted to 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto and Imperial Headquarters, simply read: "Enemy heavy bombardment in progress." With the weather now cooperating, the carrier planes ascended into scattered cumulus clouds, illuminated faintly by a quarter moon. 8 F-4F fighters, led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer from the Enterprise, were tasked with neutralizing Guadalcanal's infrastructure, including any aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. While no enemy aircraft or patrol torpedo boats were located, the fighters effectively strafed buildings along the airfield at Lunga Point. Concurrently, a second 8-fighter contingent from the Enterprise maintained a vigilant combat air patrol over the vulnerable troop transports between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock, before being relieved. Bombers began hitting Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, but throughout the morning, no enemy air opposition materialized. The Americans commanded the skies absolutely. The only planes damaged were those suffering operational mishaps. Other carrier groups focused their attention on the Gavutu seaplane base, achieving total surprise. Arriving without warning, American aircraft commenced bombing and strafing the seaplanes afloat in the harbor, systematically destroying 9 Zero-like float planes, 1 massive 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 additional seaplanes utilized for search and bombing duties. The few Japanese pilots who attempted desperate takeoffs were shot down before achieving altitude. Not a single Japanese aircraft survived the devastating assault at Gavutu. Simultaneously, other strikes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi and softened the beaches designated for the Marine landing. Before the first light of dawn, Marines aboard the transports gazed upon the high, looming mountains of their objective. The transport columns silently slipped through the narrow channel separating Guadalcanal and Savo Islands, entering Sea Lark Channel. As the sun rose, the heavy guns of the escorting cruisers and destroyers opened fire, the flashes of their salvos illuminating the entire fleet. There was virtually no return fire. The relentless bombardment ignited massive fires along the shore. A fuel dump exploded, sending towering flames leaping into the morning sky. At 8 o'clock, following 2 hours of preparatory shelling and bombing, the landing craft began their run toward the north shore, east of Lunga Point. The Marines, embarking on the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War, were understandably anxious. Yet, when the leading elements touched down on Guadalcanal at 9 o'clock, they encountered no resistance. The initial landings on Guadalcanal suggested an almost ridiculously easy advance. The Japanese, having fled precipitously into the hills, had been completely surprised. Marines advancing across the beaches soon encountered wooden barracks that had never been occupied and a chilling tableau of an abandoned breakfast. A tended mess hall filled with platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. Half-filled rice bowls and chopsticks lay scattered across the table or hastily dropped upon the straw mats of the floor. The immediate reason for this hasty retreat was visible overhead. The tents themselves were shredded by shrapnel, some having been knocked completely flat by the intensity of the pre-landing naval bombardment. However, any Marine who felt inclined to celebrate the swift conquest of these early objectives was due for a severe shock. While it was true that the Japanese on Guadalcanal, primarily construction troops, had been caught unprepared and had not yet established permanent fortifications, the fight unfolding across the channel on Tulagi was radically different. Here, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion, supported by the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines, encountered immediate and stout resistance. Positioned on this smaller island were approximately 250 dedicated Japanese fighters, identified as a Yokohama Air Base detachment under command of Captain Hashik Miyazaki. These were experienced and resolute combatants. Edson's first raiders were equally formidable, the toughest American troops in the Pacific, all volunteers chosen from the ranks of a force already renowned for its fighting qualities. The very concept of the raider units originated from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation for the creation of a specialized commando force, drawing in part on Carlson's own experience serving several months with the Chinese Communist Eighth Route Army during its guerrilla struggles against the Japanese in North China. Edson's raiders had trained for many months under intensely Spartan conditions and arrived at the Solomons with a powerful reputation. As events would soon prove, they would require every trick they had learned and would be forced to devise new ones. This invasion marked the first substantive contact between highly trained American troops and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war had commenced in December 1941. The Japanese held a reputation even more fearsome than that of the raider battalions, gained to the phenomenally rapid march of their forces across the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had crowed over its victories, convincing half the world that imperial forces were invincible, a narrative the High Command was pleased to encourage. Tulagi, therefore, stood as the first crucial testing ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwestern edge of the island, and at the outset, the going did not appear much harder than on Guadalcanal, encountering only minor resistance from a few outposts. The northwest sector of Tulagi was covered in thick jungle, small trees, tangled vines, and the beautiful yet sharp-thorned bougainvillea. At first, the terrain proved to be the worst obstacle. Edson lost only one man initially, to a sniper, as the Marines hit the beach. Edson planned to move inland toward a central ridge that ran the length of the island, then work along the top of that ridge, clearing the slopes as they advanced south. Yet the terrain was so difficult that it took 3 grueling hours for the men to chop their way across a mere mile and a half of rising ground. Having finally reached the ridgeline, the Marines moved ahead, emerging from the oppressive jungle only to run straight into the central Japanese defenses built into the hillside. The Japanese had constructed formidable dugouts and rock embrasures, meticulously placing their machine guns to create devastating, interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese defense was based on maintaining the superior height, forcing the enemy to attack from below. But the Marines found that by crawling up the cliffs, they could drop charges of dynamite and grenades directly into the dugouts, a brutal and necessary method required to advance. Even once a dugout was blown, the position remained perilously unsafe. The American advance commenced with immediate, brutal close-quarters combat. In one early engagement, Marines utilized dynamite charges to clear a heavily fortified position, killing 17 entrenched Japanese soldiers. A subsequent attempt to retrieve a radio unit saw a lone Marine enter the structure, only to be fatally shot by 2 surviving Japanese defenders. A second man who followed suffered the same fate before the remaining enemy combatants were finally neutralized. A specific section of Marines was tasked with eliminating the central island defense position, while the main body of Edson's force, comprising the center and left flank, pushed relentlessly down the ridgeline. Even along the spine of the ridge, progress was agonizingly slow. The initial afternoon saw one company sustain a staggering 15% casualty rate. While the frontal resistance was undeniably stiff, the tactical challenge posed by the Japanese was only half the battle. Snipers became an immediate and terrifying constant, seemingly placed everywhere, tied precariously into crowns of trees, concealed within the shattered remnants of buildings, or expertly hidden behind rock formations. A preferred, chilling tactic involved allowing the forward element of a Marine unit to pass, only to commence firing into the rear guard from behind. This maneuver almost invariably sealed the fate of the sniper, yet rarely before he had inflicted multiple casualties. Furthermore, the first raiders quickly discerned that the small .25 caliber slugs fired by Japanese rifles and machine guns were often more likely to wound than to kill. From the Japanese perspective, this was a satisfactory outcome, as it demanded additional troops and vital medical resources to evacuate and care for the injured. As the afternoon wore on, the raiders continued their drive along the ridge until their advance was abruptly halted by a deep, 3-sided ravine. The floor of this natural obstacle was the site of an old British cricket field. The Japanese had expertly dug into the steep ravine walls, establishing the intersecting fields of fire that would become grimly familiar throughout the Pacific Campaign. As the Marines moved forward, they were immediately caught in a devastating crossfire. Colonel Edson, recognizing the imminent dangers and the rapid approach of darkness, ordered a halt, deeming it too hazardous to probe known threats in the fading light. That night, the Marines on Tulagi experienced another profound shock. The Japanese command, realizing they were drastically outnumbered with no viable chance of survival, staged one of the death-desperate, suicidal counterattacks for which they would become infamous. Waiting until the Marine perimeter had settled into a deceptive quiet, the assault began precisely at 10:30 p.m. The attackers managed to breach the perimeter defenses between two companies, successfully enveloping one of them. The ensuing combat was savage and intimate, fought in foxholes and open ground using rifles, machine guns, grenades, and bayonets or knives. A determined Japanese thrust advanced along the ridge directly toward Colonel Edson's command post, reaching a terrifying proximity of only 50 yards before being stopped. Ultimately, the Marines overpowered the relentless assault and threw the Japanese back, but not before one company had suffered the loss of half its non-commissioned officers. The following day, August 8th, saw the landing of significant reinforcements on Tulagi, swelling the total American force on that side of Sealark Channel to 7,500 men. Edson's raiders, augmented by personnel from the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines, immediately resumed their movement toward the island's southeastern end. They systematically assaulted the formidable, dug-in machine gun positions cut into the steep sides of the old cricket ground. From one single cave complex, the Americans extracted 35 dead Japanese. Some bodies already decomposing and stinking, while others have been killed in the final moments of the defense. This grim discovery led the Americans to the accurate deduction that the standing Japanese tactic was to hold a position until annihilation, unless an explicit order to retreat was given, a testament to the fierce discipline of the Japanese armed forces. Crucially, those few troops who surrendered on Guadalcanal were overwhelmingly members of labor battalions, not hardened combat troops. On this second day, the raiders encountered dozens of examples of a fighting spirit they had never before witnessed. In one particular dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who possessed only a single loaded pistol among them. As the Marines prepared for the final assault, 3 shots rang out from the interior. Upon entering the dugout, the Marines discovered 3 lifeless bodies in the empty pistol. One officer had conserved his final 3 rounds, using them to execute his 2 companions, and then himself. The suicidal fortitude, so prevalent in those first days, deeply surprised the Marines. It was extraordinarily difficult for an American soldier to comprehend how cornered or wounded men, knowing that the enemy possessed overwhelming material and numerical superiority, would almost invariably choose death over the possibility of surrender. It was a brutal lesson that required significant psychological adjustment. The initial attempts by American forces to secure surrenders quickly dissolved. Following incidents where Japanese soldiers feigned capitulation, only to draw hidden weapons, bayonets or pistols, to attack their captors or to detonate grenades in acts of mutual destruction, the Marines fundamentally altered their rules of engagement. Recognizing the ingrained doctrine of fighting to the death, there was thereafter virtually no sustained effort to persuade Japanese combatants to yield. While Tulagi was officially brought under American control, on that second day of the operation, the claim was provisional. For several days afterward, isolated Japanese snipers, demonstrating unwavering persistence, continued to harass the occupying American troops until final pockets of resistance were eliminated. The sheer, uncompromising stubbornness of the fighting on Tulagi is perfectly captured in the harrowing experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. Goss had advanced ahead of his unit to neutralize a fortified cave position near the cricket field, from which the Japanese had been firing sporadically. Trained to pull the pin of the egg-shaped grenade, count slowly, throw, and then listen for the subsequent explosion, Goss followed protocol. He moved close enough to launch the first hand grenade, pulling the pin and counting to 6, in a move of shocking speed and precision. The Japanese defenders inside the cave lobbed a live grenade back out, forcing Goss to duck violently to escape the blast of his own weapon. After an identical, near-fatal second experience, Goss adjusted his timing, holding the grenade for a full 3 seconds before throwing on the count 4, 5, 6. Yet, defying all expectations, the primed explosive was again thrust out of the cave mouth. Realizing futility of standard explosive tactics against such determined adversaries, Sergeant Goss requested a satchel charge, a potent canvas bag packed with dynamite, typically reserved for demolishing structures. He primed the charge, thrust it deep into the cave entrance, and retreated slightly. Astonishingly, the Japanese defenders managed to shove the heavy, armed satchel charge back out of the cave's mouth just as it detonated. The resulting explosion drove a sharp rock splinter into Goss's leg. While the resulting wound was not serious enough to incapacitate him, the pain and the brazen defiance of the enemy ignited his fury. Abandoning procedure, Goss seized a submachine gun and, without hesitation, dashed into the cave, spraying disciplined fire. He personally killed 4 Japanese soldiers and, upon inspection, confirmed 8 additional bodies that had perished earlier in the engagement. If the fighting on Tulagi was brutal, the coordinated assaults on the adjacent islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo proved arguably worse. The amphibious landings commenced mid-morning, initially involving fewer committed troops than expected, as intelligence had severely underestimated the enemy presence. However, these small islands were critical due to the Japanese seaplane base located there, resulting in extensive, unexpected fortifications. The Marines immediately encountered fierce resistance. The Japanese, still recovering from the preliminary naval bombardment and aerial attacks that had destroyed their seaplanes, initially met the first troops ashore with disorganized rifle fire. However, by the time the second wave of Marines hit the beach, the enemy had organized a formidable defense line approximately 500 yards inland, and the fire became relentless. The third wave of landing craft suffered heavy casualties, coming under intense fire even before reaching the shoreline. Both Gavutu and Tanambogo were tactically dominated by small, steep hills, barely 150 feet high. Yet this elevation advantage over the sea-level landings proved decisive. The Japanese had expertly integrated their defenses along these slopes, fortifying positions and stocking them with ample supplies of machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. Just as on Tulagi, the combat devolved into a savage war of attrition. Every Japanese strongpoint had to be taken by force, as retreat was not an option for the defenders. The sheer viciousness of the fighting on Tanambogo was nearly beyond comprehension. To support the early waves, the Marines had landed tanks, which soon became the focus of suicidal Japanese counterattacks. At the Tanambogo dock where the landings occurred, Japanese soldiers surged forward, using primitive but effective methods to immobilize the armor, jamming crowbars beneath the treads, hurling grenades, and attempting to ignite the tanks using rags soaked in gasoline. In one horrific instance, a tank commander courageously opened his hatch and utilized the tank's coaxial machine gun, cutting down 23 charging Japanese soldiers before a single enemy combatant scrambled up the side of the vehicle and fatally stabbed the commander to death with a bayonet. Another defender then exploited the open hatch, tossing gasoline-soaked rags inside, causing the tank to erupt in flames. By mid-afternoon of this grueling first day, it was unequivocally clear that the Marines required immediate reinforcements. A Marine unit that had landed unopposed on nearby Florida Island was urgently diverted to assist. Though Tanambogo itself had been seized, the Marines found themselves unable to secure the crucial causeway that linked the 2 small islands. The summoned reinforcements were directed toward Tanambogo, and as dusk settled over the battlefield, they prepared for final assault, preceded by a 5-minute preparatory bombardment from supporting naval assets. A catastrophic stroke of misfortune immediately doomed the initial landing on Tulagi. One of the final naval bombardment shells struck a fuel dump near the beach, illuminating the entire shore as brightly as midday. As the Marines advanced, the Japanese defenders, entrenched in hillside dugouts, held a clear advantage, silhouetting the Americans against the sea and unleashing a steady stream of machine gun and rifle fire. 2 boatloads of Marines successfully reached the beach, but the coxswain of the third boat was killed at his tiller. The disabled craft slewed violently, heading back out to sea. The following boats, mistaking this reversal for a change in orders, did the same. Consequently, the men from the first 2 boats were stranded ashore, their only immediate protection the meager cover of the concrete pier. Japanese fire was precise and immediate. As soon as the Americans returned fire, the enemy spotted their position using the tracer rounds. Several men were quickly cut down. Eventually, one boat managed to retire, carrying the wounded, but it was some time before the confusion was eliminated and subsequent waves began to land. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack. On the beachhead, Captain Crane, the unit leader, found himself cut off from his boat. He and 5 men were forced to hide in the brush, successfully using the darkness to escape, and return to the beach only after the Japanese had withdrawn to their hillside positions. While they were eventually extricated, it was 4 o'clock in the morning of August 8th before another unit landed and finally secured the crucial causeway. The fighting for the connecting islets of Gavutu and Tenambogo proved absolute. When the engagement began, 500 Japanese defenders occupied the ground. When the fighting ended, there were none. Early on the morning of August 7th, the Tulagi radio station flashed the first word of the United States assault to Rabaul. This astounding news reached Rabaul airfield just as pilots preparing for their routine early morning harassment missions against the Australians on New Guinea were preparing for takeoff. Those orders were instantly canceled, and all available planes were dispatched to strike the American invasion force. Even before the planes had launched, they received the unwelcome news from Tulagi. The entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Contact with the base then broke, confirming the American success. At 8:30 a.m., a massive strike force departed Rabaul. It consisted of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers, which, because they had been loaded for the strike against Australian land forces, carried bombs instead of anti-ship torpedoes, a critical deficiency. Escorting them were 180 fighters. The formation climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east of Buka Island, and turned south along the Bougainville coast. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 F-4F Wildcats from the USS Enterprise picked up the approaching formation. Flying at 18,000 feet just above Florida Island, the Enterprise fighters spotted the huge formation of Betty bombers. Escorted by Zeros down below, the F-4FS immediately attacked and Lieutenant V.P. These shot down one bomber, for others began to smoke and were listed as probables. However, after this initial run, the Zeros joined the fighting force, compelling the F-4FS to adhere to standing instructions and break off the engagement, taking refuge in the cloud cover. The Americans had been seriously wounded. One F-4F was shot down, and Lieutenant Deese's plane was so badly damaged that he had to make an emergency landing on the USS Wasp. Lieutenant G.E. Firebar led another flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise, locating the enemy off Santa Isabel Island. 10 Zeros immediately descended upon them, attacking 3 of the fighters and successfully shooting down all 3 F-4FS. The remaining 3 American fighters pressed the attack on the bombers, with Ensign R.N. successfully shooting down 1 Betty. The first confirmed kill of the Zero was achieved by radio electrician T.W. Rhodes, but the Zeros returned in overwhelming force. Observing the disciplined Japanese rule, never let your wingman out of sight, 10 enemy fighters attacked the remaining F-4FS from the starboard quarter, forcing them to duck into the clouds. During this relentless pursuit, Lieutenant Firebar enlisted pilot W.S. Stevenson Jr. and pilot machinist W.H. Warden were all shot down. The initial hours of the campaign were marked by desperate action, including the search for downed pilots. Watchers monitoring the skies and seas picked up the distress signal of a fire bar near Santa Isabel Island. But though a canoe was dispatched by a Guadalcanal coast watcher, Warden Stevenson was not found. The perilous nature of air combat was evident across the fleet. The twin-engine bombers proved to be vulnerable targets, and early encounters quickly established American fighter superiority. 6 fighters of Flight 323, intercepting enemy aircraft off Lunga Point, successfully shot down 4 attackers. In a remarkable feat of airmanship, Machinist Darunian destroyed 2 enemy planes single-handedly just after 2:30 p.m. Crucially, the invasion fleet benefited immensely from the vigilance of the Coast Watcher Network. Paul Edward Mason, a civilian copper planter in peacetime, was stationed on Malib Hill on Bougainville, maintaining surveillance over the Japanese base of Ben. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Mason transmitted a critical message. 24 Japanese bombers were heading toward Guadalcanal. This advance warning arrived when the enemy aircraft were still 400 miles distant, a flight time of nearly 2.25 hours. The message, broadcast from Pearl Harbor to Fleet, reached the invasion force with ample time for preparations. The response of the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra was typical of the fleet's focused readiness. When the word arrived, the boatswain's mate piped the message. The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11 o'clock. The Japanese attack arrived precisely on schedule. The United States fighters, primarily F-4F Wildcats, climbed aggressively, reaching 20,000 feet as the Betty bombers and Zero escorts reached the north shore of Guadalcanal and looked down upon the mass invasion fleet at noon. For the first time in the South Pacific theater, the Japanese felt the full, coordinated force of a prepared counterattack. The American carrier fighters and the concentrated gunfire from the ships proved devastatingly effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Bettys that finally arrived over Guadalcanal, all but one were shot down, and the only damage sustained in that initial assault was a bomb hit against the destroyer Mugford. Against the formidable Zero fighters, however, the nature of the engagement shifted dramatically. Pilot Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace, was among the 18 pilots chosen for their skill to undertake this first long-range mission over the target. When the Japanese formation was intercepted by F-4F Wildcats from the carriers, the American pilots employed a crucial tactical shift. They went straight for bombers, deliberately ignoring the Zeros. While the Zeros provided protection for the bombers, they soon turned to engage the American fighters. Sakai was genuinely puzzled by the American tactics. Navy pilots would execute diving attacks against the Zeros, but if they missed on first pass, they would immediately scatter and evade. They had been thoroughly instructed by intelligence officers who understood that the Zero was vastly superior in turning radius, climbing ability, and overall speed. After a grim and skillful dogfight, Sakai succeeded in shooting down one F-4F and an SBD dive bomber that had bravely engaged 4 Zeros alone. During the chaotic engagement, Sakai attacked a group of SBD torpedo bombers, mistaking them for fighters, and flew directly into the concentrated, spitting fire for rear gunners. His Zero was critically smashed, and he was seriously wounded, yet he managed to fly the crippled aircraft back to Rabaul and execute a landing before collapsing. Though the Japanese maintained a temporary advantage in the sheer quality of the Zero, the American pilots and their F-4F Wildcats were already beginning to learn how to exploit the limitations of their enemy. Control of the air was obviously going to be fiercely contested. At this particular moment, the Americans held the advantage of propinquity, with their carriers positioned close offshore, but the Japanese possessed the advantage of numbers stationed at Rabaul. The American effort was further hampered by the inherent superiority of the Japanese Zero over the F-4F Wildcat, which was slower and less maneuverable, allowing the Zeros to easily gain the tactical advantage in sustained close combat. The inherent strength of the F-4F Wildcat lay in its sturdy construction and superior armor protection, qualities essential for maintaining a low-loss ratio against the experienced Japanese pilots operating from Rabaul. Though the Japanese command swiftly recovered from the initial shock of the American invasion, their fighter squadrons faced a crippling logistical challenge. The immense 1,100-mile round trip required merely to reach the battle zone. Recognizing this operational strain, Commander Nakajima, the leader of the fighter squadron, initially resisted demands from higher authority on the first day, dispatching only his most seasoned aviators. However, the requirement to commit more aircraft soon followed, and losses inevitably mounted, largely attributable to the vast distances traversed. By nightfall of the first day, the United States invasion force appeared secure. American troops had advanced near the critical airfield, encountering only minimal resistance. A captured prisoner confirmed the weak disposition of the defenders. Approximately 600 combat troops and 1,400 laborers, most of whom had already fled to the opposite side of the island. Admiral Turner had successfully put 11,000 Marines ashore, but the sheer volume of material, vast piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies, soon overwhelmed the beaches. General Vandergrift noted the beach force's inability to assimilate the supplies efficiently, yet, fearing the imminent departure of the covering carrier fleet, he welcomed the continued influx. Although a second beachhead was established, it quickly became as congested as the first. The morning of August 8th brought renewed aerial combat. At 8:40 a.m., Coast Watcher Jackred, positioned at Bua Passage, alerted the fleet to 45 Japanese dive bombers launched from Caven. 30 minutes later, Pearl Harbor relayed the crucial broadcast of the ships. Carrier planes intercepted, destroying many of the incoming enemy bombers. But the United States fleet did not escape unscathed. A blazing bomber plunged into the deck of the transport George F. Elliott, setting the vessel alight, while another dive bomber crippled the destroyer Jarvis with a direct torpedo hit, taking it out of action. That same morning, the aircraft from the Enterprise and other carriers executed their missions, finding the skies temporarily clear. They strafed and bombed troop concentrations along the Tenero River and pounded the contested airfield once more. Around 10 a.m., 3 fighters from the Enterprise discovered a critical threat. A group of Japanese torpedo bombers skimming low over the surface of the water, intent on attacking the vulnerable transports. The Americans swiftly engaged. Machinist Runin claimed 1 bomber and 1 fighter. Ensign VHH Rouse destroyed 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers, and Ensign J.D. Shoemaker shot down another. This engagement marked the cessation of significant air activity for the remainder of the day. By night's end, the Enterprise's Fighting Sixth Squadron tallied its losses. 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. The Japanese Zero fighters still retain an advantage in both pilot experience and aircraft capability, but American airmen were rapidly adapting, learning vital tactics. The commander of the Enterprise Air Group quickly determined the Zero's 2 primary weaknesses: limited firepower and a pronounced inability to absorb damage. Given the Zero's superior rate of climb, maneuverability, and fuel capacity, F-4F pilots were strictly instructed to maintain tight formations. When attacked, each 2-plane element was to initiate a scissors movement, constantly turning toward each other. This maneuver allowed the pair of F-4FS to concentrate their heavier firepower on the enemy, while capitalizing on their own aircraft's robust capacity to withstand severe punishment. Meanwhile, on the neighboring islands, the Marines faced fierce Japanese opposition. On Tulagi, 90 casualties were sustained, but the island was secured by the end of the second day. The 250-man Japanese garrison fought, fanatically to the last, resulting in 200 fatalities. Only 3 surrendered, the remainder swimming the strait to Florida Island to continue the fight. On Gavutu and Tanimogo, the Marines suffered 250 casualties, facing a 500-man Japanese garrison that was utterly wiped out to the last man. The ferocity of this initial combat set a brutal precedent. The fighting on Tulagi stood in sharp and bloody contrast to the deceptive ease of the Marine advance across Guadalcanal. By the morning of August 8th, the Marines had swiftly consolidated their positions, reaching the perimeter of the vital airstrip they would soon name Henderson Field, honoring the flyer killed at Midway. This rapid success fostered a dangerous complacency, bordering on contempt for the unseen enemy. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight." One Marine famously remarked within the earshot of Richard Tregiscus, the International News Service correspondent accompanying the invasion force. "All they do is run into the jungle." On the surface, the Marines could not have asked for a smoother initial campaign. However, this lack of opposition bred an unsettling edginess among the senior officers that second afternoon. The victory felt too readily granted. At sea, the Americans appeared equally unopposed. A handful of Japanese patrol craft tenders and 1 or 2 transports had been caught off the shore during the invasion's opening hours and were swiftly eliminated by overwhelming shelling and bombing. Only in the air did the Japanese forces offer serious resistance, giving the Americans pause. While most of the initial waves of bombers were destroyed, the cost of meeting the Zero fighters proved steep, resulting in the loss of 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 available carrier planes. This attrition, while not statistically prohibited by existing operational standards, convinced Fletcher that his decision to disengage was strategically sound. At 6 o'clock that evening, Fletcher signaled Admiral Gormley, requesting permission to withdraw his carriers, but proceeded to execute the withdrawal before a reply was even received. Admiral Turner, upon intercepting Fletcher's decisive dispatch, immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. The entire amphibious force was now left without critical air cover, and the number of Japanese aircraft could be expected to increase sharply as the enemy rushed reinforcements down the island chain. Even as Fletcher began his withdrawal, the Japanese were already mobilizing a powerful counterstroke. The flashing word of the invasion, transmitted from Guadalcanal to Rabaul, triggered an immediate and aggressive reaction from Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa. As commander of the Japanese Eighth Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, Mikawa carried the heavy responsibility for the whole South Pacific operation. His first move was an ill-fated attempt to reinforce the existing 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison, loading 6 small transports and dispatching them with destroyer escort. This convoy ran directly into the American submarine S-38, which was operating out of Australian waters following the fall of the Philippines. The S-38 successfully sank the transport Meo Maru, taking 342 men to the bottom. This loss, coupled with intelligence reports detailing the enormous American invasion flotilla, persuaded the admiral that reinforcement attempts were momentarily too dangerous, compelling him to recall the remaining 5 transports. Yet, Japanese naval assistance of a far greater magnitude was already converging on the region. Admiral Mikawa benefited from a fortunate coincidence of timing. Early on the morning of August 7th, even as the Tulagi garrison sent its final message, 5 heavy cruisers had departed Cavian, located on the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 of these vessels were initially headed northeast toward Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, while 2 were bound for Rabaul. Mikawa swiftly ordered all 5 heavy cruisers to hasten their speed and rendezvous at Rabaul. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer, moved into Simpson Harbor. The other 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel, situated between New Ireland and New Britain, for the flagship Chokai to rejoin. When she arrived late that afternoon, she carried Admiral Mikawa himself and was now accompanied by the additional firepower of the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. The Japanese strike force, now powerfully configured with 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a single destroyer, sped south toward Guadalcanal. As they traversed the waters, Admiral Mikawa meticulously composed his battle plan. By deliberately cutting speed, he calculated they could delay their arrival until just after midnight on August 8th, ensuring a devastating surprise night attack on the American forces clustered around the beachhead. Crucially, the admiral was acutely aware that the Americans possessed multiple carriers in the area while he had none. Executing a night attack guaranteed that a squadron would not be harassed by American carrier planes, exploiting the fact that the Americans possessed no established doctrine for coordinated nocturnal surface combat. The tactical reality of the Pacific War heavily favored the Japanese in one crucial area. Their highly refined specialization in night aerial and naval operations stood in sharp contrast to the American Navy's documented lack of competence in nocturnal combat maneuvers. Admiral Mikawa, the architect of the approaching strike, understood that the success of his immediate mission, to move close to Guadalcanal and support the beleaguered island defenders, depended entirely upon preserving the crucial element of surprise. The effectiveness of his attack would be magnified enormously if he could strike without warning. Mikawa was unknowingly aided by systemic failures plaguing the American command structure. The combination of a divided command authority, an inferior air intelligence system, and poorly defined search protocols played directly into his hands. American commanders at Guadalcanal relied primarily on air search and submarine reports for intelligence on Japanese ship movements. The vital, but geographically limited, reports of the Coast Watchers were rarely applicable to fast-moving naval operations. The initial sightings were dismissed. Early on August 7th, the approaching cruisers were sighted by United States B-17 Army bombers as they moved toward Rabaul. Later that evening, the Mikawa force was accurately sighted by the submarine S-38 just as it came out of St. George's Channel. The commander of the S-38 reported the contact to Brisbane, but American naval commanders afforded these warnings little credence. Since Rabaul served as the Japanese Navy's forward base, the movement of vessels in and out was deemed routine. There was no indication, they judged, that these particular ships were aggressively steaming toward Guadalcanal. Responsibility for coordinating all elements of the American attack rested with Admiral Gorley. However, Securing adequate air searches required navigating a fragmented command structure dependent on several sources. First were the long-range B-17 bombers of General MacArthur's American and Australian Army Air Forces, which operated independently and were tasked primarily with searching the Bismarck Islands, concentrating on the massive naval and air base at Rabaul. Second was Admiral McCain's land-based Naval Air Force, which included seaplane tenders and PBY patrol bombers whose mandate was to monitor the northern approaches, specifically Truk and the Marshalls. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes, intended for crucial short-range searches, made no sorties whatsoever, constrained by Fletcher's excessive anxieties. Admiral Turner, examining the charts, recognized the Japanese possessed a perfect, concealed avenue of approach to the island of Guadalcanal. This maritime corridor ran along the west coast of Bougainville, slicing straight down between Choiseul Island and Vella la Vella, past Columbangara, navigating the waters between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, before emerging between Florida Island and Guadalcanal's north coast. This dangerous lane was christened the Slot, a name soon to become infamous in American naval history. On the morning of August 8th, while detailed search patterns were scheduled, for PBYs from Nandi on a 700-mile triangular pattern, 6 PBYs from Espiritu Santo covering the Santa Cruz Islands, and 6 PBYs spreading out from Tulagi across the Slot, Turner realized with alarm that the most critical artery was completely uncovered. He urgently requested a special search of the Slot from Admiral McCain for the following day. Tragically, in a fatal administrative failure, the message was lost somewhere between Admiral Turner's flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac at Tulagi. The requested search was never executed, leaving the most obvious path for any enemy naval force wide open to Guadalcanal on August 8th.